Look at the person sitting across from you right now. Look at their nose. Now think about your own. Chances are they're not the same. One might be narrow and sharp, the bridge high, the nostrils tucked close together. Another might be wide, flatter across the bridge, the nostrils flaring outward. For most of human history, people just accepted this as one of those things bodies do. Faces are different, the same way fingerprints are different. Nobody thought there was a deeper story hiding underneath the skin and cartilage, but there is. And it's a story that stretches back tens of thousands of years across continents, through ice ages, through interbreeding with other human species that no longer exist, and into the DNA sitting inside every one of your cells right now. If you have a broad nose, science has finally started to explain exactly where that came from. And the answer is far stranger and far older than anyone expected. For a long time, nose shape was considered too complicated to study seriously. Unlike eye color or hair texture, which are controlled by a small number of genes with fairly predictable effects, the nose is built from a mix of bone and cartilage, shaped by dozens of small structural decisions made during development in the womb. The upper portion, the bridge, is bone. The lower portion, the part that gives the nose its width and the shape of the nostrils, is cartilage. Two completely different types of tissue developing on two different timelines, controlled, as it turns out, by different sets of genes. The complexity is exactly why it took so long for researchers to make any real progress. You can't study something properly if you don't even know how many moving parts are involved. The breakthrough came from an unusual place. Instead of focusing on Europeans, which is where the overwhelming majority of human genetics research has historically concentrated, a team of scientists led by researchers connected to University College London decided to look at Latin America. This was a deliberate choice and a smart one. Latin American populations carry a rich blend of ancestry, European, Native American, and African, often within a single family, sometimes within a single person. That kind of mixed ancestry is like a genetic gift for researchers because it means the same. Population contains huge natural variation in nose shape, skin tone, height, and dozens of other traits, all shuffled together in different combinations. If you want to find out which genes control which physical features, a population like that gives you far more statistical power than studying a group of people who all share very similar ancestry. The researchers recruited more than 6,000 volunteers, drawing on a long-running project called the Candela Study, which pulled participants from 5 countries: Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru. Each volunteer had their face photographed and measured in extraordinary detail. The width of the nose at the middle, the width at the base where it flares out above the lip, the angle between the nostrils, the overall shape and protrusion of the tip. Then, each volunteer had their DNA sequenced. With that data in hand, the team could do something that had never really been done at this scale before. Directly compare specific stretches of DNA to specific, precisely measured facial features across thousands of people with wildly different ancestral backgrounds. What they found changed the way scientists think about the human face. 5 genes stood out as having a real, measurable, repeatable effect on nose shape. 2 of them, called GLI3 and PAX1, are both genes already known to be involved in cartilage growth, and both were linked directly to the breadth of a person's nostrils. In other words, how wide the nose flares out. A third gene, DCHS2, also tied to cartilage development, was linked to how pointed or rounded the tip of the nose is. A fourth gene, RUNX2, is a gene that drives bone development throughout the body, and it turned out to control the width of the nose bridge, the upper, bony part of the nose, not the lower cartilage part. And a fifth gene, EDAR, which scientists already knew was connected to hair texture, tooth shape, and ear structure in different populations, was found to influence how much the chin protrudes, which affects the overall profile of the face and how the nose appears in proportion to it. Here's what makes this discovery so satisfying from a scientific standpoint. It isn't random. The genes that affect the bony part of the nose are genes already known for controlling bone growth elsewhere in the body. The genes that affect the cartilage-based lower part of the nose are genes already known for controlling cartilage elsewhere in the body. The biology lines up perfectly with what was already understood about how the body builds itself. This wasn't some strange, inexplicable genetic quirk. It was the confirmation of a pattern that makes complete developmental sense once you actually go looking for it. So there's the mechanism. The actual switches inside your DNA that decide whether your nose bridge is wide or narrow, whether your nostrils flare or stay tucked close, whether your tip is rounded or comes to more of a point. But mechanism only answers half the question. The other half, the half most people actually want answered, is why. Why does nose shape vary so dramatically from one population to another in the first place? Why do people whose ancestors came from West Africa, on average, tend to have broader, wider noses than people whose ancestors came from Northern Europe? That question sends the story in a completely different direction. away from genetics labs and into the realm of evolution, migration, and climate. For decades, scientists have floated a theory that nose shape isn't just a random cosmetic trait, but something that was actively shaped by natural selection based on climate. The idea goes like this: the nose isn't just a decorative feature stuck in the middle of your face. It's a piece of environmental engineering. Every breath you take gets warmed, moistened, and partially filtered as it passes through your nasal passages before it reaches your lungs. In cold, dry climates, that warming and moisturizing function becomes critically important because breathing in cold, dry air directly can damage delicate lung tissue over time and make the body work harder to regulate its internal temperature. A narrower nose with a longer internal passage gives air more time and more surface area to be warmed and humidified before it goes any further. In hot, humid climates, that problem simply doesn't exist in the same way. The air arriving at the nostrils is often already warm and already carries plenty of moisture, so there's less evolutionary pressure toward a narrow, elongated nasal structure, and more room for other factors: genetic drift, sexual selection, random chance, to shape a wider, flatter nose without any real cost. This theory sat around for years as a reasonable-sounding hypothesis. But hypotheses aren't the same as evidence, and for a long time, nobody had tested it properly with hard data. That changed with a large study published in the journal PLOS Genetics, which set out to directly measure whether nose shape differences across populations were the result of climate adaptation, or whether they could simply be explained by random genetic drift, the natural directionless shuffling of genes that happens in every population over generations, with no environmental pressure involved at all. This distinction matters enormously to scientists because plenty of human traits differ between populations for no adaptive reason whatsoever. They just drifted apart over thousands of years, the same way two isolated card decks would end up in different orders if nobody was actively sorting them. To settle the question, researchers used detailed three-dimensional facial imaging to measure 7 distinct aspects of nose shape: the width of the nostrils, the distance between the nostrils, the height of the nose, the length of the nasal ridge, how much the tip protrudes outward, the total external surface area of the nose, and the internal area of the nostrils themselves. They gathered this data from people representing 4 broad ancestral groups: West African, East Asian, South Asian, and Northern European. Then they compared how much these traits varied across the 4 groups against how much variation you'd expect, purely from genetic drift, based on genome-wide data. The results were sharp and specific. Most of the 7 measurements they looked at showed variation consistent with ordinary genetic drift. Nothing unusual, nothing that pointed toward active selection pressure. But 2 measurements stood out clearly from the rest: the width of the nostrils and the width of the base of the nose where it flares out. Both of these showed far more variation across populations than random drift alone could explain. That's the statistical signature scientists look for when they suspect natural selection has been at work, a trait that has diverged between populations more dramatically and more consistently than pure chance would predict. Once they had identified those 2 traits as likely targets of selection, the researchers went a step further and asked whether the geographic pattern of nostril width actually lined up with climate. And it did. Nostril width was found to correlate significantly with 2 specific environmental variables: temperature and absolute humidity, the actual amount of water vapor present in the air, as opposed to relative humidity, which is a comparative measure that shifts depending on temperature. Populations whose ancestors lived for many thousands of years in hot, humid regions tend on average to have wider nostrils. Populations whose ancestors lived in cold, dry regions tend on average to have narrower ones. This wasn't a vague, hand-wavy correlation either. It held up as a real statistical relationship once the researchers controlled for the underlying genetic relationships between populations, which is exactly the kind of careful step needed to rule out coincidence. Put simply, if your ancestors spent tens of thousands of years living somewhere hot and humid, closer to the equator, there was less selective pressure pushing toward a narrow nose, and a broader nasal shape carried no real disadvantage. And in some models, I have even offered a slight benefit for breathing comfortably in that kind of air. If your ancestors instead spent that time somewhere cold and dry, further from the equator, natural selection appears to have gradually favored narrower noses, generation after generation, because that shape did a better job of protecting the lungs from cold, dry air. Over enough generations, and we're talking about tens of thousands of years here, not decades, those small advantages compounded into the visible differences in nose shape you can see across populations today. It's worth pausing on that time scale because it matters. This isn't something that happened within recorded history. It isn't something that happened within the last few hundred generations. The climates that shaped these traits were the climates our ancestors were adapting to as anatomically modern humans spread out of Africa and into new environments across Europe, Asia, and beyond, tens of thousands of years ago. The width of your nose, in other words, may be one of the more direct physical fingerprints left behind by where your deep ancestors actually lived and what kind of air they had to breathe every single day of their lives for thousands of generations in a row. But climate adaptation and cartilage genes are only part of this story. There's a second twist, and it's arguably even stranger because it doesn't just point back to ancient climates. It points back to an entirely different species of human being. In 2023, the same broad research effort that identified those 5 nose-shaped genes in Latin American populations turned up something nobody expected. While digging deeper into the genetic data, researchers found a specific region of the genome associated with a gene called ATF3 that showed a very unusual pattern. In people with Native American ancestry in their sample, and in people with East Asian ancestry from a separate comparison group, this particular stretch of DNA didn't look like ordinary modern human DNA. It looked like it had come from somewhere else entirely, from Neanderthals. Neanderthals, for anyone who needs the quick refresher, were a closely related human species that lived across Europe and parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before eventually going extinct roughly 40,000 years ago. For a long time, they were treated in the public imagination as a kind of evolutionary dead end, a more primitive cousin species that simply lost out to modern humans and disappeared. But genetic research over the last 15 years has completely rewritten that picture. When the Neanderthal genome was successfully sequenced, scientists discovered something remarkable. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just live alongside each other for a while and then go their separate ways. They interbred, repeatedly in multiple places, over an extended period of time. And because of that interbreeding, many people alive today, particularly those with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa, carry small fragments of Neanderthal DNA scattered throughout their genome, quiet leftovers from unions that happened tens of thousands of years ago between 2 different kinds of humans. Most of those Neanderthal genetic fragments do very little that anyone would notice. They're just there, inherited pieces of an ancient genome sitting quietly among modern human genes. But every so often, researchers find one that actually does something that has a measurable, visible effect on the body of the person carrying it. The ATF3 region tied to nose shape is exactly that kind of exception. According to the researchers who identified it, this Neanderthal-derived genetic material specifically contributes to increased nasal height, meaning a taller nose, measured from top to bottom. And crucially, when the team examined this region more closely, they found clear evidence that it had been under natural selection. That's a significant and specific claim. It means this piece of Neanderthal DNA wasn't just carried along passively by chance, the way a lot of ancient genetic material is. It was actively favored by evolution. People who carried it appear to have had some kind of survival or reproductive advantage, generation after generation, which is why it persisted and spread rather than fading out over tens of thousands of years, the way most neutral genetic variants eventually do. Why would a taller nose provide any kind of advantage at all? The leading explanation circles right back to the same climate adaptation logic already discussed, as modern humans expanded out of Africa and pushed into colder, drier regions of Europe. And Asia, efficient warming and humidifying of incoming air, became a real physiological challenge. Neanderthals, remember, had already been living in those exact cold, often harsh environments for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived there. Their bodies, including their nasal structure, had already been shaped by evolution to handle that climate. So when Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, some of the Neanderthal genetic solutions to that exact climate problem, including this particular nasal height variant, got folded directly into the modern human gene pool. And this wasn't even the first time this same research group had found evidence of archaic human DNA shaping the modern face. Back in 2021, the same broad team had already identified a different gene, one influencing lip shape, that traced back not to Neanderthals but to the Denisovans, yet another extinct human species, one that interbred with modern humans in Asia and the Pacific, and about which far less is publicly known, partly because far fewer Denisovan fossils have ever been found. Taken together, these 2 discoveries, a Denisovan-derived gene shaping lip form and a Neanderthal-derived gene shaping nose height, paint a genuinely striking picture, significant, specific features of the human face that we walk. Around with today, features we might casually think of as simply our traits are in some cases not purely modern human inventions at all. They are inherited, in a very literal sense, from other species of humans who no longer exist, folded into our genome through interbreeding that happened deep in prehistory and preserved because they turned out to work. So where does that leave the broad nose specifically, the trait this whole conversation started with? The honest scientific answer is that it isn't the product of one single gene or one single ancient event. It's layered. There's the cartilage development machinery, controlled by genes like GLI3 and PAX1, which set the baseline architecture for how wide the nostrils and nasal base can flare during development. There's the long, slow hand of natural selection operating over tens of thousands of years, nudging nose width in different directions depending on whether a population's ancestors were breathing hot, humid air or cold, dry air for most of their history. And separately, layered on top of all of that, there's the influence of nasal height, partly shaped in some populations by a fragment of DNA borrowed from an entirely different human species that vanished from the Earth tens of thousands of years ago. Your nose, in other words, isn't just a single trait handed down cleanly from parent to child. It's a small walking museum of your ancestors' migrations, their climates, and in some cases, their genetic encounters with other kinds of humans entirely. Numbers help make this concrete, because otherwise it's easy for all of this to stay abstract. Researchers measure nose width using something called the nasal index, which compares the width of the nose to its height, giving a simple ratio that can be compared across populations. When scientists have looked at this measurement across different ancestral groups, people of African descent have tended, on average, to show the highest nasal index, meaning relatively wider noses, while people of European descent have tended to show the lowest, meaning relatively narrower ones. Populations with Latino or East Asian ancestry have generally landed somewhere in between those two extremes. It's also worth noting that nose shape isn't purely a matter of ancestry and climate. Sex plays a measurable role too. Across essentially every population studied, males tend, on average, to have wider nostrils, longer nasal ridges, more prominent nasal tips, and a larger overall nose than females from the same population. Age matters as well. The cartilage in the lower nose continues to change slowly throughout adulthood, which is part of why many people notice their nose looking slightly different, often a bit larger or less firm, later in life compared to how it looked in their 20s. None of this contradicts the genetic and evolutionary story. It simply adds more layers on top of it, more variables working alongside ancestry to produce the specific nose sitting on any one individual's face. Twin studies add another useful piece of evidence to this whole picture because they let researchers estimate just how much of nose shape is genetically inherited versus shaped by other factors like environment or random developmental noise. Estimates of heritability for different nose measurements have landed at meaningfully high levels, well above what you'd expect if nose shape were mostly a matter of chance or upbringing. Nostril width, the width of the base of the nose, and how much the tip protrudes have all shown heritability estimates strong enough to confirm that genetics is doing real, substantial work in determining these features, not just contributing at the margins. There's a broader point worth sitting with here because it says something about how the whole field of human genetics has operated and how it's slowly starting to change. For decades, the overwhelming majority of large-scale genetic studies focused almost exclusively on people of European descent. That's not some sinister conspiracy. It largely reflects where research funding, universities, and existing genetic databases happened to be concentrated. But it created a real, practical blind spot. If you only ever study one branch of a very large family tree, you're going to miss huge portions of the story, and worse, you risk mistaking patterns that are specific to one population for patterns that apply to humanity as a whole. One of the lead researchers on the Neanderthal nose study said it directly. Most genetic studies of human diversity have investigated the genes of Europeans, and this kind of diverse sampling broadens the reach of genetic research, helping scientists understand the genetics of all humans, not just one slice of them. That's not just a nice sentiment, it's the actual reason this discovery was even possible in the first place. There are practical applications sitting on top of all this pure science too, and they're worth mentioning, because they show why this kind of research matters beyond pure curiosity. Understanding exactly which genes control which facial features has real value in forensic science. If investigators recover DNA from a crime scene but have no witness and no suspect, being able to predict physical characteristics, nose width, nose shape, likely ancestry, directly from that genetic material could eventually help build an approximate visual profile of a person, narrowing down a search in ways that were previously impossible. It's also worth clearing up a common misconception before wrapping this up, because it's an easy one to fall into. None of this research suggests that any nose shape is somehow better, more advanced, or more evolutionarily improved than any other. Natural selection doesn't work like that. It doesn't move towards some universal ideal of a perfect human face. It simply favors whatever combination of traits happens to work best for survival and reproduction in a specific environment at a specific time. A broader nose wasn't a compromise or a lesser outcome for populations in hot, humid regions. It was, in that context, simply the shape that carried no real disadvantage, freed up from strong selective pressure and shaped instead by ordinary genetic variation, sexual selection, and chance. So the next time you look in the mirror or look at the face of someone across the table from you, there's a genuinely deep story sitting quietly in that shape. A wide nose, a narrow one, a rounded tip, a pointed one, a tall bridge, a flatter one. Every version carries a trace of specific, identifiable biology. The activity of genes like GLI3, PAX1, DCHS2, RUNX2, and EDAR, quietly directing cartilage and bone growth back when you were still developing before birth. The long, patient pressure of climate acting across thousands of generations on ancestors who breathed hot, humid air or cold, dry air for their entire lives. And in some populations, a genuine fragment of Neanderthal DNA inherited from an encounter between two different kinds of humans that happened tens of thousands of years ago and never fully disappeared, because it worked. Your nose was never random. It was built gene by gene, climate by climate, sometimes species by species, into the exact shape sitting on your face right now. And this whole area of research is still moving. The genes identified in the Latin American study were a first major foothold, not a final complete map. Since that original work, other research groups have gone looking for similar patterns in different populations, including studies of Han Chinese and other East Asian cohorts, and studies focused on populations of European ancestry, turning up additional genetic variants tied to facial width, facial depth, and nose shape that weren't part of the original discovery. Some of these newer studies have confirmed earlier findings, showing the same genes like PAX1 showing up again in connection with nasal width in completely separate populations, which is exactly the kind of independent replication that gives scientists real confidence a finding is genuine and not a statistical fluke. Other studies have turned up entirely new genes in populations of African ancestry, linked to overall facial size that hadn't previously been identified at all. Piece by piece, the genetic map of the human face is being filled in population by population, and every new study adds another data point to a picture that, until fairly recently, barely existed. What's striking, stepping back from all of it, is how much of this had been sitting there the entire time, encoded in plain DNA, simply waiting for the right combination of large enough sample sizes, precise enough measurement tools, and diverse enough participant pools for someone to actually go looking. The width of a nose, something so ordinary that most people never think about it twice, turns out to be a genuine record of deep human history, a record of ancient climates our ancestors adapted to over tens of thousands of years, and in some cases, a record of encounters between different human species that most people never learned happened at all. Genetics keeps doing this again and again, across every trait scientists manage to properly study, taking something that looks completely mundane on the surface and revealing, underneath it, an enormous and genuinely surprising story about where every one of us actually comes from.